Hey guys, this is Charles Yeager with AE Scripts. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the Crosssphere Bokeh effect that's available from AE Scripts, and it's a lens blur plugin for After Effects that gives you full control of the bokeh shape and tonal mapping. It works similarly to the camera lens blur effect that's already in After Effects, except this renders quite a bit faster. I would say probably like 4 times faster, and it gives you much more realistic results, and again also allows you to customize the bokeh shape. We're going to take a quick look at the plugin, and then I'm going to show you how we can combine it with depth passes from other plugins such as Element 3D in order to get even better results. Also want to mention you guys can download a free trial of the Crosssphere Bokeh effect from AE Scripts right now if you want to follow along with this tutorial. Alright, let's go ahead and jump into After Effects. Alright, one quick disclaimer really quickly. I know that the proper way to say bokeh I think is bokeh, but I've always called it bokeh. So it's going to be a tough habit for me to break through this tutorial, so I'm just going to continue to call it bokeh. But anyway, let's just go ahead and take a quick look at the Crosssphere Bokeh effect and see what we can do. So I'm going to right click here in my scene. I've got an element scene that I've created, and I'm just going to create a new adjustment layer. And I'm going to come up here to Effect, and I'm going to find Crosssphere and apply bokeh. And immediately we can see we get this really nice, eye-pleasing bokeh result. It already looks like a fairly realistic blurred background, and you can see we get these really nice tonal highlights on everything. And that's what I really like about the Crosssphere Bokeh effect compared to the camera lens blur. You'd have to do a lot of tweaking in order to get all these bokeh shapes kind of bright and tonal like that. So let's look at some of the controls. We have the blur radius. You can see as I can increase this, and the bokeh shapes are going to get bigger. We have vertices. So you can see they've got 6 vertices right now. We can change this, I believe, from 3 to 10. So I can increase this to something like 8. And then what I really like to adjust is the roundness right here. And you can see as I increase this, the bokeh shape is going to completely go spherical. And I usually like to put this around like 0.5, kind of halfway in between, and maybe with like 6 vertices. That way it just kind of gives a little bit of a rounded edge in between the points. I think that looks a little more realistic. Next option we have is the concentration. You can see as we adjust this, it's going to kind of change how the bokeh looks. And you can see it's kind of more blurred. And then if you go in the negative direction, you kind of get this like hollowed out center, which can be nice depending on the look you're going for. I'm going to set that back to the default of 0. Next we have the deform. If you want to kind of change the shape of these to look more like an anamorphic lens, so I might increase the roundness here all the way up to 1. And then I'll increase the deformation right here. You can see it's kind of going horizontal. And I'll just adjust the rotation back to 0. And now we kind of get more of an anamorphic type camera lens blur there. I'm just going to quickly set this back to the defaults of what it was. Next we have a custom blur shapes. This is really one of the big things that sets this plugin apart from the other native effects. So I'm going to come in here and I've got a custom blur shape. You can see it just says high on it. I'll drag that into my composition. And I'm going to turn off the visibility of it, but on my layer with Crosssphere Bokeh, I'll come down here for custom blur shape. I'm going to select my custom blur shape, and now you can see the bokeh is all whatever that blur shape we had was, and of course you can adjust the exposure or the blur radius, that kind of thing with that shape. So this is just a nice option to have, and you can really get creative. You could import your own bokeh shapes or even pull real bokeh shapes from a photograph and import those in here. Again, just giving you quite a bit of varied results. I'm going to go ahead and turn back off that custom bokeh shape. Now a few other options we have down here is the exposure. And I really like to kind of adjust this, and it's just going to brighten up the tonal highlights of all the bokeh effects. I'm going to set this back down to something like 20. And then of course we have repeat edge pixels here around the edge. I think that's on by default. And then we have the depth map, and this is what we're going to actually use with our Element 3D layer to kind of give us a more realistic depth pass and more realistic bokeh results. So I'm going to go ahead and come back up here, and I'm going to reset the effect, and I'm actually going to turn off the blur layer. I'm just going to go ahead and click this. I'm going to rename this blur, just so we know what that is. And I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to go ahead and delete my custom blur shape. Now let's take a look at this Element 3D scene here. I just want to kind of break this down to give you an idea of what it is and show you the process of kind of giving us that depth pass. So I'll click on my element layer. I'm just going to go into the scene setup. Now for this element scene, what I've got is just a few buildings from the Metropolitan Model Pack from Element 3D. And then I've got the Empire State Building here. And what I'm going to do is kind of get a shot of the Empire State Building in the foreground and these other buildings in the background. And I added a little bit of space in between here. That's just going to help kind of sell the look of where we're focusing in on this front building in the foreground, and everything back here will kind of be blurred out with the bokeh effect. So I'm going to exit out of that, and now we're back in our scene. I'll just go to a custom camera view so you can see this one more time. And again, you can see there's our building, and we have the other buildings in the background, and there's where the camera is. So again, what we need is a Z-depth pass. So in Element, if we come down here to Output, you're going to see you have a Show option here, and you have Composite. We can actually change this to be Z-depth, so I'm going to select that. And with a Z-depth pass, what we're looking at here is whatever is completely black is going to be what's completely in focus, and then further back as it goes completely white, that'll be completely out of focus. So whatever the total white is, that's going to be completely blurred out using the Crossfire Bokeh effect. So it'll be essentially at 100%. And we can make adjustments to the Z-depth here. You can see we have the Z-depth start and the Z-depth in, and you can toggle this to control how much you want to be in focus and out of focus. And again, in my case, I want the Empire State Building to be completely in focus. That's why it's totally black here. And these other buildings are starting to kind of fade in to have some bokeh effects on them, and then it'll be completely white in the background. Now, there's a few extra tips you're going to want to use when you use a depth pass with Element 3D. The first one is going to be the multi-sampling and super sampling. You're going to want to increase those, because if these are decreased, we'll just kind of zoom in here. You can get some really nasty kind of jagged edges, and those will show up on the Z-depth pass. So I definitely recommend increasing that as high as you can on your machine as far as it'll allow. And then also turn on the enhanced multi-sampling. That's going to help quite a bit as well. And then on the background, you're going to notice here we get this weird edging around the buildings that are kind of the furthest to the background. And I'll show you a quick way we can fix that. You can see that over here as well. And that will show up on our depth pass if we don't fix that. So what we need to do to fix this, you need to come over here and turn on Preserve Alpha. And when we check that on, it's actually going to remove the background. You can see the background's now completely black. But we don't want that to be in focus, and I'll show you. If I come down here and turn on the alpha channel, you can see there's actually nothing there. And so a quick way we can fix this, I'm just going to right click and create a new solid. And on this solid, we want it to be completely white, because again, it's going to be at an infinity back there. Click OK, and I'll just rename this BG. Make comp size, and click OK. And we're going to place this at the very bottom down here. So it's, again, in the background. So if we toggle the alpha channel there, we're going to see we don't have anything else back there, and again, we got rid of those weird edges on those further buildings in the background. So what we need to do is we need to pre-compose a Z-depth pass from this element layer. And in order to do that, I'm going to select my element layer that I've got right here, and I'm going to hit Control D or Command D on a Mac to duplicate it. So now we have two copies, and on this top copy that we have, I'm going to change that back to composite so it looks normal. So there's our shot. And just for the time being, I'm going to turn off the visibility of that just so we don't get confused. So we have our Z-depth passive element, our background, and now we need to go ahead and pre-compose that. But in order for us to have the same view, we also need to duplicate the camera. So I'm going to select the camera here, and I'm going to hit Control D, Command D on a Mac to duplicate that as well. And I'm going to grab that new camera we created. I'm going to place it right down here with these other three that we're going to pre-compose. So we have a camera, we have the element, Z-depth pass, and the background. I'm going to select all of those, hold Shift and click. And then come here to layer and then pre-compose. And we'll just call this Z-depth. And I'm going to come over here and click OK. So now we have our Z-depth pass, and I can turn back on my Element 3D layer. So there's our composite view. So let's go back up here to the top of our blur layer, which is our Crossfire Bokeh layer. It's on an adjustment layer. I'm going to turn the visibility for that back on. And I'm just going to do a little bit of adjustment on the roundness here. I'm going to put that at 0.5. So in the depth map area, what we're going to do for layer, we're going to come down here, we're going to select that Z-depth composition that we created. And now we can see the results of that. If we zoom in here, we can see the building in the foreground is completely in focus. And that's what we wanted. And you can see these buildings, as they get further and further back, the bokeh shape is going to get larger because they're further away from the camera. And again, that's giving us a more realistic result. And if we want to go ahead and tweak the blur radius, we can tweak that a little bit here. Might increase that to 30. And you can see the results we're getting from that. Now, you want to be careful how far you increase it, and realistically, it would probably be a lot smaller than this. It probably would be closer to something like 15, because if you increase it too big, it's going to kind of make it look like a macro, like a miniature type model, whereas in this case, even though they're a little bit smaller, it's just giving us a more realistic result. So let's look at some of the things we can adjust on the depth map here. We have the channel, and right now it's currently set to RGB, and that's what you're going to want to use it on if you're using a black and white depth pass. You can use some other ones such as red, green, or blue channel, or an alpha channel depth pass as well. And for the placement, you're going to want to leave that on center map, but if your depth map didn't fill out the entire frame, you could select stretch map. And then resolution is definitely a key one you're going to want to play with, because sometimes you can get some weird edges or the bokeh won't quite look right. And you can go ahead and increase the resolution here. I'm just going to pull this all the way up and just kind of smooths out a few things. It may render a little bit slower, but it tends to give better results in my opinion. And another cool thing we can adjust now with our depth pass, because we have that depth information, we can adjust the focal distance. Now default, I typically leave this at 0 because I already know what I want to have in focus and out of focus. But if you did want to make some fine adjustments, you can do that. You can see as I increase this, it's going to change where the focus is. So now you can see the foreground building starting to go out of focus. And then if I actually pull this all the way up to 1, it's going to give us kind of an interesting result where this building is now completely out of focus in the foreground, and these are starting to come into focus in the background. And so that's another cool option you can experiment with. And finally, the profile, it's just going to allow you to kind of make some fine-tune adjustments here. And it's going to tweak the overall intensity of the effect. You can see as I increase this, the bokeh shapes are going to become more and more exaggerated. And if I bring it into the negative, they're going to become less and less. And then finally, you have the option to invert the depth map. And you can see as I click that, it's going to make the foreground building go completely out of focus and the background buildings come into focus. And this is the same technique that I used with the Star Wars scene that I created before and sent out some shots of. So you can see I've got this shot of BB-8 here, and I'm just going to do the same exact thing we did on the buildings. I'm going to select my element layer, and I'm going to come down here to composite and change that to be Z depth. And you can see BB-8's completely in the black area, and then I have the background going out to completely white. And again, you can adjust where the Z depth starts from. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to duplicate that element layer again just to run through this process. So we have 2 different copies of element, and I'm going to duplicate the camera, and I'll take 2 of these, place them at the bottom, and go to layer, pre-compose, and I'll just call that depth, and click OK. And then go back to my original element layer, and I'm going to change this back to composite. And if we go to the crossfire bokeh effect right here, I'll change the depth map here to be the depth pass that we pre-composed, and I'll turn the effect on. And now you can see we're applying that bokeh just to the background there. And you got to be careful with some of the fringing around the edges. Now, one good thing about the crossfire bokeh effect, it does do a much better job than others. So that's why you want to make sure you really have nice multi-sampling on when you're using this with any depth passes. But again, tweak the resolution to get varied results, and sometimes they'll look a lot better, and then also adjust the profile. There's a few other compositing tips though we can apply to the crossfire bokeh effect to get even better results. There is a Robyte plugin called Separate RGB. It's also available from AE Scripts, and I highly recommend that. I want to show you how I like to use that with the crossfire bokeh effect to get even more realistic results. So I just right click here, I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to call it RGB. And with that selected, I'm going to come to the effect. Then I'm going to come down here to Robyte, and I'm going to select Separate RGB. And that's going to separate this out into 3 different channels. So I'll come down here to the red channel, and for red scaling, I might set this to be 100.5. And you can see it's just going to give us that nice kind of chromatic aberration fringing on everything, especially on the bokeh back there. And I could also adjust the distortion if I wanted to. I might set this to be negative 0.3, just to give it a little bit of extra distortion. And then finally, you can also add some film grain or just use the native grain in After Effects on top of this to give it some nice texturing. So I'm going to right click here and do another new adjustment layer. And I'll select that. I'm going to hit enter, call it grain. And then with that selected, I'll come to the effect and go to noise. And then I'm going to do add grain. Again, if you have film grain or something like that, that can give you a lot better results. But if you don't have anything else, this is a good option. This is a little bit slower to render with the add grain effect in After Effects. So I'm going to come over here to viewing mode, and I'm going to select this to be final output. And then I really want to dial this back quite a bit. So I'm going to come down here to the grain effect. I'm going to hit T on the keyboard. And I'm going to set this to be on something like 20. And you can see it dial it back. But if I zoom in here, you're going to see a little bit of texturing, and that can look really nice on top of the bokeh highlights and stuff like that. It just kind of helps sell the composite to be more realistic. Alright guys, that's pretty much the gist of it, but I really enjoy using the crossfire bokeh effect, and I think you guys will too. And you can even use it to create some nice kind of luxury style backgrounds. You can see this is just a basic element scene, nothing really difficult or intensive at all here, just random objects I've got spinning with kind of some highlights coming through. And then if I apply the crossfire bokeh effect on top of that, you can see you kind of get this nice luxury looking background, looks kind of photorealistic. And so again, we went from some basic element objects here to now the new background in the Zales jewelry ad there. So definitely a lot of fun to experiment with. Alright guys, it's been Charles Yeager for AE Scripts. Thanks for watching.